Welcome everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the CIP Forum 2020. Today's focus is on digitalization, and we're going to have a very special look into big tech in the digital economy. To help us understand the interface between competitive strategy and competition policy, we're going to start with a speaker that needs very little introduction, but I'll just give a little one anyway. Our keynote speaker today is David Teece, professor at University of California, Berkeley, and the chairman and principal executive officer of the Berkeley Research Group. Professor Teece, the floor is yours. Let me get your presentation going.
Thank you, Bo, and delight to be in front of this group. While I'm going to be talking about competition policy today, I'm coming at it from the perspective of innovation. I'm an innovation scholar looking at competition policy. Sadly, there are very few competition policy folks who are also innovation folks. So needless to say, there is a tension between a lot of the preachings from competition policy folks and what we know is true about innovation. So today I'm going to try and join innovation and competition policy to make sure that competition policy doesn't kill innovation, which it is likely to do if we continue down the current path. Next, please. Next slide, please. I'm going to make the statement here, it's rather bold, but I think it's true. The very nature of competition has changed. In other words, the economist's traditional views of competition have to be dramatically modified to take into account the powerful role of innovation, which has always been there, but is now more amplified, the role of the internet, and the role of big data. We have to create new intellectual frameworks, analytical tools, and mindsets that can envelope these developments if we're going to come up with a useful theoretical framework to inform competition policy. And needless to say, technologies moves faster than intellectual frameworks. In fact, I'll go as far as to say the intellectual frameworks really haven't moved very much for a long period of time, despite obvious changes in the economy. Next, please. Now, in a way, thoughtful people in the agencies are aware that the models that they use are what I call static, and that the tools that are used are what I call static. And by static, I mean they're impervious to considerations about innovation, at least substantially so. They're at least ill-adapted to the issues at hand. So here we have a recent statement from Christine Wilson saying innovation over the longer run will deliver very large consumer welfare gains. Yet competition authorities routinely struggle to account for dynamic effects. And she's absolutely correct. And they struggle because, not because they don't recognize that innovation is important, they'll all check the box and say innovation's important, but then they'll proceed merrily to do their analysis without making one iota of modification. And Tom Rosh gave a thoughtful speech, over a decade ago now, he kind of perhaps put his finger on it. He said, well, of course, innovation and dynamic competition matters, but the reason we don't use dynamic analysis is because the framework is less well developed. It's not being operationalized, which is a heck of an admission. It's saying, well, we're going to continue to use tools that we know are wrong. And if somebody is willing to put shoulder to the wheel and modify the tools, they'll be happy to pay attention. I think it was their job to put shoulder to the wheel and actually come up with a new framework, but they didn't, and that leaves it to us. Next, please. Here's some, traditional notions that I would say most competition policy folks hold to, and they don't even question them. First of all, competition comes from rivalry within industries and markets and from substitutes. I'll say in a moment why that's not necessarily very accurate anymore. They tend to look at numbers of competitors and entry barriers and other structural indicia of competition. I'm not sure those measures are particularly meaningful anymore. And thirdly, and most blatantly, they see competition driving innovation, which we would all agree in the innovation community, but they don't see the causation going the other way, innovation driving competition. So look at Jonathan Baker's book, or a number of the other, major theses and monographs on competition policy and innovation. They only see it going one way. Anybody that ever glanced at Silicon Valley would know that innovation drives competition, at least as much as competition drives innovation. But the models are stuck in a world that never existed, and no one seems to bother to try and re-engineer things to take this obvious reality into account. Next, please. What is it that we can say about the new forms of competition? First of all, I would emphasize that it's innovation that drives competition. One consequence of that is that innovation policy should be our main competition policy. I'll come to that later. First of all, I'm not sure that the whole idea, or secondly, I'm not sure the whole idea of relevant markets means much anymore. Competition doesn't take place as much in markets as it does within ecosystems and between ecosystems. Maybe ecosystems should be at least the initial unit of analysis. And within ecosystems, complements compete too. And when I say complements compete, the way to think about competition is in terms of where is competition for rents? I mean, we have this model that competition is about competition for product market share. Well, no, at a more fundamental level, it's about competition for rents. And once you take that view, then complements can compete with the focal firm and with substitutes. Complements and substitutes look much more alike, because a complementer can suck the rents out of an ecosystem as readily as a competitor can. And that's hardly rocket science. My paper back in 1986 called Profiting from Innovation was essentially about the fact that the owners of the complementary assets could end up running away with the pot of gold. None of that thinking has ever permeated competition policy thinking at all, nor is the fact that complementers can quickly morph into being competitors. And in the tech space, you see that happening all the time. And it's not like over a 5 or 10 year period. It could be a 5-minute period. Or maybe Hal will tell me it could be even quicker than that. But competition is just very different. And the textbooks and the preachings haven't changed to take that into account, at least not very much. Next slide, please. Let me just give you a little example of the sort of nature of competition from complements. You'll remember the Apple II didn't go any place until VisiCalc came along, and VisiCalc really, goosed up the sales of the Apple II, and it was a complement. And ditto with IBM, the Lotus 1, 2, 3 helped IBM, but it also hurt VisiCalc and VisiCorp. And then the IBM PC comes along and Microsoft Excel comes in, and you have, not only the complements competing with each other, but eventually the complements competing with the focal product as well, at least impacting the fortunes of the focal product. So right away, you can see that competition can come horizontally, it can come vertically, it can come laterally, it can come from, it's what I call 360-degree competition. And in a way, it's what Nicolas Petit has referred to as broad spectrum competition. Broad spectrum competition is an excellent way of summarizing this umbrella that, we cannot shove things into boxes according to the old way of looking at things. Look at Netflix, now competing with the studios. Well, in some sense, that's an upstream, downstream story, but it's also more complicated than that. And it's a story about lateral, vertical, and horizontal competition all wrapped into one. I've not read a single paper in competition policy that really attempts to make this point, although it's a point that I think needs to be made. Next, please. What are the implications? As I've already hinted at, relevant product markets perhaps no longer meaningful as arenas for assessing competition. The broader ecosystem is a better competitive arena to look at. Substitutes compete with complements and complements compete with other complements. And also the whole concept of entry barriers, at least at minimum needs to be relevant. And this is where I point out that actually, to show you how intellectually wooden the antitrust community is, these issues that we're talking about here are discussed over in a field called technology management and strategic management, but never once has anybody in the competition policy area cracked the books to look at what's going on in the field of strategic management or technology management. You will see that I frequently cite across both fields, but I'm a loner, and that's really unfortunate. And there at the bottom, I make the point I just made about broad spectrum competition as being an important new idea. Next slide, please. What have I done here? Have I messed something up? So I'm trying to get rid of something. There we go. Moreover, platforms have to innovate or they'll be overtaken. There's a sort of notion gotten out there now that there's tipping points and there's this sort of inexorable trend that once an incumbent gets to a tipping point, it's the end of the story. But my point of view is incumbency only gives you a seat at the table for the next round of innovation. That's really a quote actually from Andy Grove at Intel, who said this many years ago when everyone was pointing to Intel as being a monopolist. But just think about how fragile that monopoly is. If you screw up in any round of innovation, you're out. No easy life for the monopolist. As John Hicks always said, the feature of monopoly is that management lives, quote, an easy life. Well, if that's the criteria, nobody in Silicon Valley can live an easy life and stay in business for very long at all. Excite and Locos, they competed against Yahoo, then Yahoo lost out to Google. I mean, yes, certainly this is an example from the early days of platforms, but I think you'll also see that platforms can be deeply impaired if the management doesn't stay on top. And needless to say, the whole field of competition policy has managed to go on for 100+ years without really any role for managers in it. Other than, quote, behavior. The notion of corporate behavior is there, but looking beyond that to understand what managers can do and how actually the identity of the management team can impact competition and innovation, it's just completely missing from competition policy. And maybe competition policy people would say, well, that makes it too complicated. Well, maybe it does, but it makes it more realistic in a way that is important. Next, please. Where are we in all of this? Well, because we've not been able to, launch a dynamic capabilities perspective. I've tried to launch one for 30 years with almost no success. I've been talking to myself and half a dozen friends for 30 years. And as a result, the so-called progressives on the left, like Lisa Khan, are able to walk in with yesterday's ideas, even more ossified theoretical frameworks from the ages of the railroads and big oil, and claim that they have the high ground with respect to understanding what's going on. Obviously, that's wrong, but in some sense, the mainstream is culpable for that phenomena because they left a huge void, which enables, very improper intellectual frameworks to find a footing. Certainly, there's been work on insided platforms, but if I read, quote, the new IO, it sort of begins and ends with platforms. I admit that looking at platforms is a good start, but it's not where you should finish. And innovation should be the primary lens through which you're looking at competition, whether that innovation comes from platforms or from somewhere else. It's also important to look at data curating and orchestration. These are critical. I'm going to be very curious as what what Hal has to say about this, but if you don't understand big data, how can you understand competition in the tech space today? And it's not just about having big data, it's about how you use big data and how you archive it and how you reuse it and how you orchestrate it. Without an understanding of that process, you can't understand the competitive advantage and competitive success of particular firms. And now, of course, there's, I call it almost reckless focus on divestiture without any understanding of how big data matters for competition policy as well as for competitiveness. So these debates are going off half-cocked with a very imperfect understanding of the underlying phenomena. But, you know, the community of competition policy scholars has a lot to explain, in my view. Next, please. So, what is it that's different? I talked about complements morphing into competitors, complementors becoming competitors. Nicolas is, I think, focused rightly on what he calls indirect entry. And that's maybe a way to help the mainstream guys understand that we're talking about entry that is indirect only in the sense that it's not what they used to think of as entry. But in the tech sector, you know, it's probably more correctly called direct entry, but because there's a ossified understanding of the nature of competition, we have to call it indirect entry. And new entrants can successfully target particular market segments with differentiated offerings, and size alone affords little protection. Look historically how workstations disrupted mainframes, PCs disrupted workstations, tablets disrupted laptops, on and on and on and on. And successful new entrants are ones that, of course, coming in with innovation. It's innovation that's driving competition, just as assuredly as competition drives innovation. Next, please. Now, just as an exemplar of the rather unfortunate state of affairs we're in today, you know, even the seamless integration of data and services, which of course is enormously beneficial to consumers and users, is now being targeted as something that's being wrong. Ease of use is important in digital markets, and integration facilitates ease of use. And just because something's difficult to replicate, it doesn't follow that it should be regulated. So the focus on what the ultimate goal is here, which is, you know, in our view, long-term consumer welfare, not short-term consumer welfare, but long-term consumer welfare, would lead one to see that data integration is actually very valuable for achieving that goal. Next, please. Now, I've done a little bit. There's so much going on that somebody like myself has trouble keeping up with everything that's being proposed. But the EC is proposing market interventions to supposedly enhance competition among platforms by making it data available to potential rivals. And no analysis whatsoever of what that does to dynamic competition, no analysis of what that does to integration. And there seems to be no analysis of what in competition policy we call competitive effects, and just simply an assumption that this would lead to an improvement. Now, no analysis because I don't think they have the frameworks to even think about this for the very reasons I've articulated. Next, please. You know, my friends and colleagues are telling me, David, your thesis too late. The trains left the station. Regulators coming by hook or by crook. So sadly, we may have to recognize that. I'm not quite that pessimistic myself. I still think there's a chance to launch what Nicolas and I call a dynamic competition initiative to try and turn heads so that they have a better understanding of what's going on. But you know, what are the pegs in the ground that one should have with respect to analyzing policy changes in the future? Well, top of my list is respect to intellectual property rights as well as confidential data. And this is where big tech sometimes can be folded. You know, they like to protect their own intellectual property and then walk over other people's intellectual property, and that's not appropriate. One has to be consistent and respect intellectual property rights. And if big tech is not sensitive to that proposition across the board, then they undermine the basis of their own long-term success. We should, as a policy matter, favor business conduct that keeps Me Too imitators at bay. I mean, a lot of the folks that want to, quote, get in aren't coming in with anything distinctive. They're coming in with I just want to share the rents and take a slice of the pie without contributing anything new. And good policy making should avoid those circumstances. Incumbents shouldn't be required to provide a helping hand to competitors. That undermines the very nature of competition itself. And if there are services that have to be provided or licensed, it should be done at full cost, not the kind of errors and mistakes that took place in the telecom system in the United States. And then, one should bear in mind, and there's competition authorities are not doing this at all, of the nature of what I call systemic competition from China. Systemic competition is competition where you have a state-owned enterprise and where, business enterprises are operating either in conjunction with each other or with collaboration with the Chinese government to essentially exploit the companies that are in the Western democracies. And no longer can one, cover one's eyes to the obvious different nature of competition. I said earlier on that competition has changed in the digital economy. It's also changed because of China and different ways of competing and different motivations. I mean, you can't use a predatory pricing notion of recoupment if you're dealing with a company from China, because they don't care a whit about long-term recoupment. They care about, owning markets and owning ecosystems and owning standards. But the competition policy folks just trot out the usual shibboleths of things that matter. And then finally, I think without an understanding of dynamic capabilities, you can't understand business failures and business successes. So it's sometimes easy to attribute successes in markets to, quote, market power, when it's really just coming from better management and what we call dynamic capabilities. Next, please. So, let me just sort of tick off some of the building blocks towards a third way. Nicolas and I coined this term a third way. We're not saying that we want to find some middle ground between competition policy as it was, static, and competition policy as it should be. We want to do something that is more than, we need to do something that's more than just a simple incremental change to the existing frameworks. We need a third way forward. And in that third way, you need a theory of complements that's more fully developed. By the way, that work is taking place in the field of strategic management. There's a rich literature on it, on ecosystems and complements. None of it's oriented towards answering competition policy question, but many of the foundation stones are there. Nicolas has launched the concept of oligopoly to capture this broad spectrum competition idea, which I think is very, very important. And that's one way to look at it, but certainly he's marked out the territory, and we need to look deeper into all of those issues. I think we can still live with the consumer welfare standard for competition policy so long as it's long-term. The consumer welfare standard that's currently used by the agencies is a 1 to 2 year period, which is utter nonsense, and is really one of the reasons why the consumer welfare standard has become the enemy of innovation, because innovation doesn't necessarily provide you with a price reduction in 1 to 2 years. It may provide you with amazingly significant price reductions over a longer time period and completely new and better products. So dropping this sort of short-term focus should have happened a long time ago, and is one of the reasons why the mainstream is being deflected from defining the problem the right way. We need to understand dynamic capabilities. We need to understand the role of entrepreneurship. We need to understand the role of venture capital. All of these things matter. And also, and this is my point 5 here, it's absolutely remarkable that competition policy has been able to go along for 100 years without really differentiating between different types of rents. I think we do recognize that monopoly rents, due to restricting competition, that's sort of naked and not justified. You know, that's what I think of as a monopoly rent. Most of what is being earned in big tech today is what I call Schumpeterian rents or Ricardian rents. And we want companies to capture Schumpeterian rents to keep the innovation machine going. We want companies to capture Ricardian rents so that we eliminate bottlenecks and scarcities. So a competition policy framework that pays no attention to the nature of rents is, to me, a pathetically weak structure for looking at the reality of big tech or anything else for that matter. And the only reason why people don't make these distinctions is because it makes it hard. But you know what? We have to do hard work if we want to get the right answers. And then we also need a new theory of potential competition. You know, how the heck can you understand potential competition? How the heck can you understand competition itself without an understanding of firm level capabilities? It's remarkable. Nobody in Silicon Valley or in the tech sector would think that you could understand what's going on without understanding the capabilities of firms. But competition policy economists think they can. And the reason they think they can is because they have no theory of capabilities. I think if you sat them down, they would say, of course, capabilities matter, but then nobody's lifted a finger, except for one or two people, to try and figure out a theory of capabilities. Once again, the field of strategic management has made an effort, but there's a long way to go. Next, please. So as a result, you get some fiascos. The Facebook acquisition of Instagram is a case in point, because the natural tendency of antitrust people is to look at markets and pricing, and if something's giving away free, oh, there's no issue. Well, that's because they have no theory of capabilities. If you had a good theory of potential competition, maybe that case would have been decided differently. Look at the FTC case against Qualcomm. You know, just treating a royalty payment as nothing more than a price, or as my dear friend Carl Shapiro called it, a tax, just completely misconstrues the nature of royalty income and the importance of innovation. So the FTC really stubbed its toe there. Thank goodness the Ninth Circuit came in and saw the obvious, but we can't always rely on the courts to get it right, particularly if most of the economists get it wrong. And then again, with Alstrom Siemens, no attention at all to the different nature of competition from China. Very, very wooden approach. And I'm not saying the answer would be different necessarily, but certainly the analysis would be different. I suspect the answer would be different. But how can you possibly understand what's going on if you turn a blind eye to the different nature of competition? Next, please. So how do we get out in front on this? Well, you know, we get out in front by crafting a theory of dynamic competition. And putting innovation first will lead to competition policy becoming supportive of dynamic competition. When that happens, there'll be some type of alignment between industrial policy folks and technology policy folks. So there's actually a second reason, besides getting competition policy right, that if we can actually craft a theory of dynamic competition undergirded by dynamic capabilities, then suddenly, instead of technology policy and industrial policy and competition policy being enemies and in silos, we have a chance to actually have an integrated approach, which of course, China has figured that out a long time ago. And we're just dunces stuck in the past, not able to bridge the gap. In fact, most competition policy people have a complete allergic reaction to any discussion of industrial policy or technology policy, not recognizing that in fact our antitrust policy is our competition policy is our industrial policy, and China's and our industrial policy is what's left over after China decides what industries it's going to target. So we have industrial policies. Europe is very clear about this. The United States, because of the economics profession, we can't even have a reasoned discussion about it because of fear that it means that the government's going to be, quote, picking winners. Well, that's a sophomoric debate. We should be way beyond that, but sadly, we're not. Next, please. Coming to the end here. So the conference organizers put awkward questions to us and said, well, you know, let's be practical. What suggestions do you have for EC Commissioner Investigator? And, you know, I say, first of all, I make an apology to her as an economist and say, the field of industrial economics has let you down. I'm making the apology on the part of the field. I've tried to obviously swim the other way, but I've had no success. So I'm doing my mea culpas. And I just want to tell her that most of the advice she's getting is, you know, completely sophomoric. She should talk to people in industry, and she should talk to people in strategic management and technology policy, and people that actually know something about competition as it exists today. She has to recognize it's going to take some time to build a sound intellectual and policy framework which favors dynamic competition over static. But if she's willing to get out in front and say she's going to push for dynamic competition, then we can start to fill in behind her. But, you know, until we do that, we have to battle head on against a bunch of folks who are part of the problem. And we have to come to grips with an understanding of how the nature of competition in big tech is different. What's the initial focus? I think it should be on the role of big tech competing with other big tech. You know, the big tech doesn't stick to its own swim lanes. You know, Amazon competes with Apple, which competes with Google, and everybody competes with everybody. But the traditional lens for looking at this puts them all in separate relevant markets with high market shares, which is complete nonsense. But that is the mainstream view because the rest of us haven't had a chance to speak. We also need to tell Commissioner Vestager that she should be looking at complements and complementers as competitors, if not now, then in the future. Yes, I think she's already onto the fact she needs to understand the role of platforms, but I don't think she's onto the fact that she needs to understand the role of dynamic capabilities and that management matters. You know, it's taken Professor Bloom as an economist to actually publish articles in economics journals with titles that management matters. And the economists are the only folks on the planet that think that somehow or rather management doesn't matter. And it matters for competition policy as well as for everything else. And until we get management sort of integrated more thoroughly into competition policy frameworks, then we won't understand what's going on in the real world. Next, please. So I know there's quite a number of Europeans in the audience, so I dug up this quote from Jean-Jacques Savin-Scribert. I remember reading this book when I was a very young person. And at that point, Europe was worried about being overrun by American big companies, you know, the General Motors of the world, the General Foods of the world, the IBMs of the world at the time. And Savin-Scribert said, it's time for us to take stock and face the hard truth. What threatens to crush us today is a more intelligent use of skills. So he was looking at the fact that American companies at the time were actually better managed than European companies. And then he went on to say then, and I think it's relevant today, what Europe needs is the ability to transform an idea into reality through the talent for coordinating skills and making rigid organizations flexible. Now, that's what I have talked about. Some of you may be aware of dynamic capabilities. And really what Savin-Scribert is saying, hey, listen, the solution is not policy interventions to block competition from the United States. The solution is that we've got to improve our game. We've got to up our own game. And we need more dynamic capabilities. We need a more entrepreneurial approach. And I think both things are needed. One, you need a more entrepreneurial view of things, but you also need a better intellectual frameworks. And that's where I think the dynamic competition framework, with the help of all of you folks here, can really assist. Next and last, please, Bo. Well, you know, this is just a bunch of things I've written over the past 20 years or so, where I've been a lonely voice in the wilderness, trying to say that we needed a dynamic competition to be the center, the focal point of competition policy. You know, sad to say, the message fell on deaf ears in the main. And maybe it's because of the messenger, but I think it's more because of the message. I'll leave it at that.
David, thank you very much. Thank you for challenging our intellectual framework. I know you did it in the context of competition policy, but I would also say that you're relating innovation not only to competition policy, but also needs to be focused for mainstream economics, as you say. So you're hitting on competition policy, but I think all economics needs to listen. So thank you very much. I look forward to having you on the panel now, so everyone can come forward. Let me introduce the moderator for the panel, a good friend and colleague of mine who's the joint chair of competition law at the European University Institute, Nicolas Petit. He's written a great book with the same name as our session today, Big Tech and the Digital Economy. If this was Oprah, we'd have a copy of that book under your chair. But it's not too late to buy it and get it in time for Christmas. So it's great to have you here, Nicolas. I know we have a mix of European perspectives and American panelists, but the world is a small place, and Europe is doing its fair share of government action. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Please take it away, Nico.
Thank you very much, Bo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, very good. So I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank David for the amazing keynote, and also for really opening a bridge with this last slide on Le Défi Américain from Jean-Jacques Savant-Chabert. So that was in the 1960s, I think 1967, if I recall. Well, I can't recall, I was not born, but I recall the cover of the book. And the Europeans responded to Le Défi Américain, the American challenge, with what we call now the Brussels effect, which is rather than probably investing in creating what David calls dynamic capabilities, responding with policy innovation. And what we're seeing today in Brussels and in Europe is a flourishing of policy initiatives guided by policy-guided evidence, really trying to sharpen knives towards a sector of the economy called big tech, or more technically referred to as digital gatekeepers. And I think what we want to do here is discuss these contestations and developments in Europe, which at some extent have a wider effect in the world, with spillovers on policy innovation, certainly in the United States, with increasing enforcement activity against big tech firms like Google and most likely Facebook in the next days, but also other companies, across the tech spectrum, including maybe, Qualcomm and the Intels of the world, and beyond the United States, with also initiatives in China, Korea, India, and so on. So we want to really discuss that. And to do that, I'm joined by four very distinguished panelists. David was introduced. We're also very lucky to be with Varian, Chief Economist at Google, Kirti, Gupta, Vice President at Qualcomm, and Rima, Alaily, Deputy General Counsel at Microsoft. So the demographics of the panel are quite US, if I may say, with most panelists being based or working for US located organizations. But I think it's a good start because most of the phenomenon we're discussing here, big tech, is pretty much US centric. Also, most of the people on the panel, including probably David, work for organizations which once have been labeled dominant companies in Europe and maybe beyond. So I want, correlation is not causation. I learned that at school, and there's no sense that there's any sort of common set of determinants between the views of the various panelists here. But I think it's good to some extent give a say to these firms which have, or members of these firms which at some point in their history have sat on the bench as defendants in antitrust proceedings to also unearth the perception. We've heard a lot about the policymaking structure, and maybe much less so about the business organizations themselves. Now, I've asked the panelists, with the exclusion of David, to start this session by giving me maybe one or two sentences about what they think about what they heard from David in the keynote. So we can start directly with that. Rima, just quick thoughts on what David said.
Well, I love David's focus on innovation, and I think I agree. It's something that has been missing from the larger debate. Really a theory and understanding of what actually drives innovation and what actually limits innovation. And I don't see that integrated into the overall debate about how we ought to reform competition policy. So I appreciate what he had to say.
Thank you very much. Kirti.
Well, I think it's the right time now to think about the new tools for putting together some, method in the madness for understanding how do we deal with the, perceived challenges, if you will, but challenges nonetheless of big tech digital platforms, et cetera, as we try to overhaul the competition policy frameworks, both in US and EU and, frankly, in all other jurisdictions. So it's really important to recognize this sort of framework that you and David have been working on, the connection between innovation and competition, but also the connection between innovation and economic growth, which makes this all an imperative right now.
All right, thank you. And Hal, quick thoughts on David?
Yes, well, I'll mention three remarks. One is David said that everybody pays lip service to innovation, but nobody really dives into it in a significant way. I can only say amen, that's certainly right. And a case in point is the Competition Market Authority report. You look on page 3 and they say, well, innovation is really critically important. And then they never mention it again for the next 450 pages.
Right.
Quite remarkable. Second thing about emphasizing the competition between the companies, very, very important, hugely important. Look at things like personal digital assistants, where Apple comes out with Siri, and 9 months later, Google comes out with its offering, and now you're seeing lots of other players using these kind of voice control, voice search capabilities. That's a very, very big deal. And finally, the last thing is a bit of a puzzle, because you say it's competition among ecosystems. I would have to agree with that, but people treat these ecosystems differently. So Apple has a very strong ecosystem. They don't want to interoperate with other providers. Google, on the other hand, every product we make has to run on an iPhone because we want our products there, and they've been very successful. People use Google Maps on the iPhone, people use Google Search, and so on and so on. So it's not a pure competition on individual products. It's not pure competition on ecosystems. It's kind of a mixture of the two.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful for the future buildup of the conversation. Now, in preparing this panel, I asked every participant to come up with one big idea for competition policy in the digital economy, and I said big because it's all about big tech. Big is bad, and I needed to come up with a question about a big idea, but it can be a pretty concrete and practical idea. So we're going to start with this question with Hal, who wants to show some slides. And then we'll move on with Rima and Kirti.
Yes, I've got a few slides I put together on innovation. They're mostly factual, looking at how these companies do indeed compete using, in a dynamic way. So let me pull that up. Whoops, that's not it. This is it. And now I'll share. And I should be showing some sort of, oh, here we go. Tech and innovation, and we'll share it. Oh, whoops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to screen share. Stop. You are screen sharing. How do I know here? Just do that.
Present.
Present, yes, I can't find, there it is. It's trouble is, it's on my screen, it's hiding behind, there we go. Hiding behind another box, and I didn't know how to move the other box. Okay, quick run through on a few slides on tech and innovation. One is venture capital. When you look at venture capital, there's a very nice chart here from Venture Source. The dark bars are initial funding. The light blue bars are subsequent funding. And the black line is the number of rounds, money raised by year. And you can see what's happened is we've now finally surpassed the 2000 dot-com bubble, and the general trend has been up, up, up. So there's no crisis or no problem with respect to funding. And even now, even during the pandemic, we're still seeing strong funding for venture capital. That's true in US, that's true in Europe. You see the picture here, slightly different in the last few years compared to the American case. And now we go to PitchBook, which also compiles this data. And notice, instead of having that increase that I just showed you in the other cases, there's actually been, according to PitchBook at least, something of a decrease. And Economist magazine ran a story on this saying American tech giants are making life tough for startups. Well, is it really tough for startups? Why are we seeing one provider showing an increase in numbers and the other a decrease in numbers? I actually got into the weeds on this one and dug through the raw data. And it turns out what happened is PitchBook was including angel and seed funding in the deal count. That's the green line over here in this chart. Whereas the actual VC funding is shown in the black and the red bars. And essentially the seed and angel funding was kind of a bubble that popped in 2016 or so, and that was the sole source of the PitchBook picture. So it's nothing at all like the Economist indicated. It's really simply a case of one segment of the market getting ahead of the rest. R&D spend. This is a very sobering chart. This looks at the division between business and federal government research and development spending since 1953. And you can see back in the early 50s, the government was providing the biggest offer, about twice as much as business. And now here we are in 2013, 2014, business providing about twice as much funding as the federal government. And lucky for us, business has stepped in there to do that R&D. Innovation, tech companies are the leading spenders on R&D. If you look at this chart, there's Amazon, Alphabet, Samsung, and so on. EU is strong in autos and pharma, age in telco and consumer electronics, US in these online services. And if you look at companies besides just the GAFAM companies, that is, you look at other technology companies as well, that would be all the red lines up there. You can see that it's very, very strong in terms of R&D expenditure. And in fact, if you look at Google in particular, Google has doubled the fraction of revenue that it spends on R&D. It was about 8 or 9% back in 2002, and now it's about 15%. So it's roughly twice as big as it was back in the early 2000s. So there's a heck of a lot of money going into R&D at Google and at other tech firms. And in fact, it's very high quality research. This is a chart showing the acceptances at the #1 AI conference. Well, it turns out the biggest one is Google, followed by Stanford, CMU, MIT, and Microsoft. Those are the top 5 companies in the #1 AI conference. And if you look at machine learning, there's an overlap there, but there are 2 different conferences. Again, Google, Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, and CMU are the top contributors. So it's not just research, but it's very high quality R&D that's being applied in those markets. I'm going to skip that one. And of course, it's not just AI and ML. Here's quantum supremacy, which Google reached about a year ago. And the latest thing you've probably seen is protein folding, where the 50-year-old problem of trying to predict how proteins will fold has been a grand challenge in biology. And many people thought it would take decades more before the problem was solved. Well, DeepMind's, a subsidiary of Google, managed to solve it just in the last month. So it's really quite impressive and should lead to many improvements in biotech over the next couple decades. Let's say a word or two about acquisitions. Important point about acquisitions, there's been 5 times as many exits via acquisitions as IPOs. So the red line is acquisitions and the blue line is IPOs. 5 times. So the normal way to exit from venture funding is not to have this flashy IPO, but rather to be acquired by another firm. And as we'll see in a second, that is widely recognized by the entrepreneurs who are running these startups. So Silicon Valley Bank runs a quarterly survey of startups. 57% of them in 2018 said that they expected to be acquired. Only 18% saw an IPO, and that's probably overly optimistic. Now, being acquired is generally viewed as a very, very positive outcome, because it's typically the large companies that do the acquisition that are able to actually deploy the innovations that are worked on by these small startups. So it's a very fruitful interaction between the two sides of the market. And many, if not most, acquisitions are acqui-hires of small teams. That is, you're hiring it because you want a team of people who can work together, who can may not have a product, but at least they have progress towards a product or a great idea. So Android is a great example. Google realized it needed to get into the mobile phone market. The original threat was from Microsoft, but it turned out ultimately to be from Apple. There were 8 employees, and only 5 of them were engineers. And they had no product. They'd been working on an operating system for mobile phones for less than a year. But Google added a few $1 billion and a few thousand engineers, and then they were able to create a mobile operating system. And let me point out a simple but obvious point, obvious but important point. Hiring a team of 5, a company with 5 employees is a heck of a lot easier than hiring 5 separate engineers. Plus you get a team that's worked together and have created something of value. So this model of thinking of small companies, of startups as being kind of postgraduate education, that's a way to think about it, because most of them by far will end up as acquisitions. And finally, I think I have 1 or 2 more slides. Kill zone. Kill zone is said to be an area not worth operating or investing in since defeat is guaranteed. And it is claimed that these that this is a dominant force in Silicon Valley these days. Well, let's look at AI, what I was talking about before. Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Europe, China, they all have major AI initiatives on their research level. And surely no startup would want to enter this kill zone because it'd have to compete with everybody else. But when you look at the data, it's quite the reverse. In 2018, there were 610 small firms that were working on AI and ML. So they certainly didn't scare anybody off. And in fact, it's quite the reverse. The fact that the acquisitions are the driving force in Silicon Valley now means that these small companies are going to go where they think they have the best chance of being acquired by a large company. And that chart is relevant in understanding not only the small firms' expectations, but in fact how Silicon Valley economy is working these days. And I think I will stop at that point. Let's see, this did not, I'll stop at that point.
Thanks, Hal. One thing that's striking in what you just said is, it strikes me that in the policy discussion, it's all the description of the facts is just the other side of the mirror, and I'm just wondering, how did we get there if the empirical footing of the policy is so wrong? I mean, if I trust you 100%, the policy has to be based on wrong empirical facts. And so my question is, and we can save the question for later, but how did we get there? I mean, how did we get with, there must be at least some middle ground in terms of the empirical facts, and why did we get them wrong? So let's park that for a moment. And I moved to Kirti and then Rima for the one big idea. Kirti.
Thank you, Nicolas. Very interesting points made by Hal in this one big idea. And I think I'll be following up on that because, back to the connection that David made between innovation and competition, let's make again another connection between innovation and economic growth, which makes all of this an imperative. It was in 1980s when Robert Solow made the connection between innovation and economic growth. Technological improvements, as he describes it, improvements in business processes or products, and they become innovations and they drive economic growth. We know that now, that innovation is the most important driver of economic growth. So it shouldn't be surprising to us, all this data that Hal has presented, and the fact that the firms excelling in technology and innovation today have grown themselves and the economy and have become enormously successful. Yet it's this growing sentiment against the platforms, the so-called FANGs or the GAFA companies, that has led to this enormous support for radical antitrust proposals in the recent past. This big is bad narrative has found a foothold even in the US, even though economically breaking up firms that offer complements may be a recipe for more market power, not less. But this narrative supports the idea of giving up benefits for consumers under the expectation that smaller firms may generate some other benefit for society. To be clear, this is not an economic argument, right? It's a political argument. It's perhaps a political preference. So really, because of that, the one idea that we all need to focus on is defining and measuring the goals that these changes seem to be trying to be achieving in this new era of competition policy for digital economy, and defining and creating the tools for measuring those goals. So first of all, what are the goals? Is it not economic growth? Is it not competition, maximizing competition or the competitive process? Is it access to competitors or small firms? Is it fairness? Is it income inequality? More income equality, less concentration, more privacy? What is it? And then articulate also what are the consequences of some of the bold and broad competition policy changes for those of us who don't necessarily qualify as platforms, and for those of us who are, far smaller than, all of us here in large established tech firms, and ultimately for the overall economy. So let me just illustrate by example, right? Some recent proposals would reverse antitrust rules to place the burden of proof on businesses to prove that a merger or acquisition is pro-competitive. And they'll also intensify merger scrutiny in many ways for all types of mergers before potential approval by regulators. Now, this is directly flowing out of the sentiment that I think Hal was alluding to against the big tech firms acquiring their rivals as an evil business strategy and killer zone kind of ideas. But the reality of innovation for startups, represented in Hal's data, is that most startups, majority of startups, rely on being acquired as a successful exit strategy. So these proposals are only going to make the acquisition or even the beginning of small companies much harder, because being merger acquired is no longer an exit strategy, but you only have two options: you go public or you fail. So being limited in this way has a chilling effect on what? On startups, on the venture ecosystem, ultimately on innovation, and ultimately on economic growth. So even, that's sort of one issue, just the, getting the goals right and the tools right. But I also want to talk about a more practical problem, right? Like even for the fans of those, wanting to endorsing the use of antitrust tools to remedy these, ills of society, if you will, let's address a practical challenge. It's the lack of convergence in goals and in procedures. So, let's face it, this is an area of law that is often criticized for its inconsistencies, both within an agency and certainly across jurisdictions. But simple things like lack of common standards, even procedural ones, significantly enhance uncertainties for businesses, again, creating efficiencies and reducing investments, right? Which is counter to economic growth. It's a very simple fact. There are 130 plus antitrust agencies in the world today. Simply put, there aren't 130 plus countries with the rule of law, where these decisions can be challenged, reviewed, held accountable. So of course, industrial policy is applied under the guise of competition policy. Let me share a very simple example. Qualcomm recently tried to acquire NXP Semiconductors. It needed regulatory approval from 10 jurisdictions. The deal was approved by 9, but it never went through because the 10th jurisdiction, China, the then MOFCOM, simply ran out of time. They didn't disapprove the merger. And why did this happen? Because the deal got stuck in the broader US-China trade war. This is what navigating antitrust for global businesses looks like today without, even the issue of convergence on goals and substance. So, we'll never get convergence on procedure or goals, but venturing into this territory with vast economic consequences for firms, for societies, even for economic growth without any measurable goals and tools to measure them is madness without method. So I would really like to endorse, some of David's suggestions, like, let's try to think about, maybe the ship has sailed on whether competition policy in the digital economy should repurpose itself to address so-called concerns of platforms. Like you said, David, train has left the station, according to your friends, but what about the new tools? What about evolving from, relevant products to definition of ecosystems rather than just getting rid of market definition? What about, evolving from entry barriers to isolating mechanisms rather than saying, we don't need, this evidence-based approach, or we need to reduce the barrier for effects-based analysis. So I think it's really time that it's up to us, the expert and the academic community, to define these measurable goals and hold the policymakers accountable for whether these proposed tools and remedies are designed to meet those goals and also identify unintended consequences. I'm sorry if I went out of time. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Okay, over to Rima.
Thanks, Nicolas. I hear very much David's call, which was very compelling, quite frankly, for a third way. At the end of the day, I think, though, ultimately I'm a pragmatist, and, I think regulation is coming for all of us in the tech industry. I think digital technology and our industry has probably gone longer with less regulation than any other major technology before it. And I don't think that dynamic is sustainable. And so I think the question for me and kind of the big idea that I'd like to explore a little bit is there frankly a third way for regulation, to borrow from David's idea, right? How do we actually approach regulation in a way that is not as rigid and slow with respect to adaptation as we've seen in the past, right? And so in the same way that as David put, we have kind of a competition policy or an approach to antitrust that has been focused or informed by our industrial era past, how can we move into a world of regulation around competition that is not similarly informed or beholden to kind of to the modes and the approaches of the past? And I think there is something that can be learned, frankly, from frankly the software and technology companies, right? So we have an idea of what we call agile development when it comes to software development, right? And it is, you know, a type of development that really targets complex systems and products that have sort of dynamic, non-deterministic, non-linear characteristics, right? So very iterative, very incremental, very evolutionary, short feedback loops, right? And adaptation cycles. And so if you think about that in the context of regulating in digital markets and digital companies, regulation becomes not a one and done type approach, but how do we build in mechanisms in the regulatory framework that allows the regulation to proceed incrementally, for regulators to learn and to adapt and have a flexible framework? I think as part of that, you know, it's not anything goes, you know, there needs to be some sort of conceptual framework, a set of principles, a set of goals that are animating the space in which regulators are working, but there needs to be mechanisms for regulators to innovate and to learn along in the process. And I think at some level it has to be collaborative. Digital companies have to be part of the process. Now that always carries dangers. You hear about capture and the like. And so regulators certainly need to be empowered and experienced and in a position where they can have, there isn't a complete information asymmetry. But I do think that digital companies need to be part of that dialogue, and frankly, regulators can benefit from the dialogue. One of the final things, I think it's absolutely critical that, you know, to borrow a term from the software industry, that there are KPIs, right? What are your key performance indicators? I do think that we need to be, government regulators need to be self-critical and hold themselves accountable to a set of goals and metrics about whether or not the steps that they're requiring are actually being effective. And in the context of this conversation, you could think about what might some of those measurements be in 2 to 3 years. Do we actually have new companies entering? Do we actually see innovation happening, and where, and how do we measure it? And if not, then how do we change or back away from the regulatory frameworks and structures that we've put in place and actually do something different? And not simply get stuck in the current structure that we're in. So with that, I'll stop because I know we're short on time.
Thank you, Rima. That was excellent. And I think we have now a sort of good understanding of the landscape. It seems fair to say, you know, going from David to Hal, Kirti, and Rima, that there are a certain amount of empirical facts that seem to run against the sort of empirical consensus, policy consensus that we hear, but, you know, it's also larger than that. There's politics in the mix, and that also explains, you know, and possibly, you know, maybe lower levels of regulation in tech than other industries, as Rima said. So that might have built up demand and supply for what we're seeing in Europe, and this is coming. So one of the questions that I keep asking myself is, what will be the sort of concrete impact that the EU regulatory experiments will have? So we know that the EU has tabled or is tabling a regulation which will subject digital gatekeepers to a set of very strict prohibitions, principle-based, not really like what you said, Rima, adaptive, sort of, you know, lists of practices like self-preferencing, bundling, and restrictions to bypass and killer acquisitions, which will be prohibited. I don't know if it will be a hard prohibition, but there will be restriction here. And beside that, maybe a more investigative instruments, which will allow the Commission and maybe the national agencies to look into markets in search of failures, structural market failures. What can we expect from that in terms of the impact on innovation? What's your idea about that? Maybe collecting remarks from Kirti, Rima, Hal, and David. Kirti?
I'll let other panelists go on this one, Nicolas.
Rima?
Sure. I think it's going to cause a great deal of uncertainty. Obviously, we don't know what the regulation is actually going to look like. We've seen some leaked drafts, but then also, reports that they're undergoing substantial revision. And so, I hold out hope, but I'm also expecting and preparing for the worst. I think a lack of clarity is going to be the most damaging. If we aren't certain about who falls in scope, if we aren't certain about exactly how the regulation or how the prohibitions and the guidance applies to companies, it's going to create a great deal of uncertainty. It's going to create a great deal of churn and kind of internal chaos, at least at the big tech companies. And it's going to slow down, frankly, their willingness to innovate and take risks, in new product areas with new business models and with new approaches. Now, I don't know what it's going to, if it will embolden other companies, right? Smaller, more innovate, not necessarily more innovative, but smaller companies who are trying to enter. I don't know if it will embolden them in actuality. I think that remains to be seen. But I think the greatest danger is the uncertainty that it injects into the marketplace.
Thank you. Hal?
Well, I think we're already seeing it. So take GDPR, there's a lot of work that's looking at the early impact of that. And it is something that adds a lot of cost to businesses. And if you're a small business and you've got this extra cost of adhering to this set of regulations, then it's going to be bad for entry. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, the question is, after they've had a few years of experience with GDPR, can they go back and fix it? It's very, very hard to go back because you're going to have adherents who are supporting the existing status quo. But if you are thinking about true experimentation, as we talked about earlier, then you've got to be willing to revise things, update them, change them, evolve with the industry, and so on. So absolutely, I agree with Rima. This is a lot of uncertainty. It's already here, and it will only get worse.
David?
Yes, I found all of the comments incredibly useful. And Rima, really what you're suggesting is that regulators need dynamic capabilities too. You're absolutely right. In fact, Mariana Muscatato from University of London, I believe, she has made the same point. Look, I mean, how could we possibly deal with global competition and innovation unless we have flexible regulation that actually learns? Now, you can say, well, how do you need the rule of law? Yes, but you've got to have zones of discretion and a well-articulated theory of innovation. Coming back to where Kirti was, yes, we need KPIs, we need benchmarks. I think what has to happen is that someone needs to say, stop, we don't know what we're doing here. The emperor has no clothes. Let's at least put a pause on this regulation until we figure it out. Let's admit as regulators, we don't know what's going on. Let's admit as companies that you've done very little to help the world understand what you're actually doing and the nature of competition. Look, the emperor has no clothes. It's at least a pause. Hit the pause button until we can have some constructive dialogue around one key theme: innovation first. Innovation first to drive economic growth. Innovation first to give us the most powerful form of competition policy we could hope for. Innovation first so we can deal with the China issues. So Hal is right. I mean, people in the agencies say innovation first. There's like this tipping of the hat. And it's not just recent, Hal. It's been going on for 30 years. They say the same thing. Innovation is critical. And then because they're basically intellectually lazy and they've got a vested interest in a set of tools that are not fit for purpose, they march on and ignore it. So the reason why in the rest of that volume there was nothing is because it got nothing to say. But it's not that bleak. There is a field called innovation studies. There is a field called strategic management. And while not all of it is, high quality research. A good deal of it is very insightful. So we need to hit a different set of books here to get up to speed. But I think the first thing has to have two first things. One, put innovation as number one. And no one would argue with that. But then point two is we don't know how to craft agile, flexible policies that will enhance innovation and competitiveness and competition. And if we can get that dialogue going, at least slow the train down, because the train's about to go over a cliff.
Thanks, David. So keeping with this discussion, you closed your presentation, David, with a set of concrete suggestions for Commissioner Vestager. And I'd like to, pick the thoughts of the panel. Kirti, this time you won't dodge the question. If you had a chance to, spend a dinner with Commissioner Vestager and you'd talk shop, she would ask you, I mean, she's very curious. She's always been very curious since she started on her mandate. And she had advisors who, suggested these ideas that we are discussing today in your ears. Now it's your turn. What would you say to Commissioner Vestager? Kirti, you're on the line.
I'll get started. So, well, I guess, one thing to say is in some areas, we've seen this, in other not, for the commission to try to incentivize the industry itself to try to come up with solutions rather than the regulators doing their center planner approach and putting the thumb on the scale to favor one kind of innovation and disfavor another kind of innovation. I would like to ask, how's that working out for you? And really, even the remedies that often the commission has imposed on some of the companies, even on this call, they've hardly worked in Europe, right? Like they've not even had the intended consequences. Forget about understanding what the unintended consequences are. So really trying to approach, having a more of a market-based approach may be a better idea. And second is because of this, right? Like not having a sense of the remedies and the consequences they're having, really drive on the importance of effects-based analysis from the agencies. One of the things I would like to point out is, this is not only good for the credibility of the commission in and of itself, but also for the goals that they have themselves articulated that they're driving, right? One of the things I would like to point out is what the structural changes that you must know, Nicolas, the agency has recently done, DG Comp, is to put its economics team under reporting to the investigative staff team. So unlike the FTC, they're not an independent agency voice that can comment on and question on the cases that are being brought in, but are reporting up to the case team. This really puts the economists at a disadvantage. This really that's why the economic analysis is frankly, a tool to serve the goals of the staff rather than a sobering voice to try to bring more evidence and effects-based analysis in an area that desperately needs some.
Okay, that's a very concrete piece of advice. Rima.
Sorry there, took me a minute to unmute. Well, I think, at least from my perspective, the Digital Markets Act has been very much on our mind. And so if I had the opportunity to talk with Commissioner Vestager, and I know she probably doesn't need my advice on anything, but I think there are sort of three things that at least have been a focus for us. One is, as they think about regulating in this space, I think it's incredibly important that they avoid taking, what might be characterized as a structuralist, or, I think they've talked about it as a self-executing approach to the regulation. That is, trying to determine who fits in or out by looking at a set of metrics like what is your annual revenue or how many active users do you have on your platform. I think, that's very tempting. It's certainly much easier to execute against. But at the same time, I think it misses the fundamental dynamics and characteristics of what's happening in the market. And so I really do believe that you need to be taking an individualized assessment of the various platforms in order to determine whether or not they need to be subjected to regulation. The second point would be that you could have a set of obligations that operate at a high level that apply to kind of everybody who's covered by the regulation. But I really think that the prohibitions, the do's and don'ts, need to be informed by the specific business model. You have to have an understanding of what's happening in the around the specific business model, what prevents entry, what allows for innovation, what blocks it, and you need to have regulation that is responsive to that. The platforms are very different in terms of their business models and how they operate, and you cannot have effective regulation if you don't have that in mind and you're not responding to it. And the final thing, I think, which goes with sort of what I was talking about earlier, which is you've got to figure out a way to future-proof the regulation, right? How do you create some ability for it to adapt and be flexible? How do you build in periodic reviews where the teams or the regulator is looking at who's covered, revisiting those assessments, looking at the actual prohibitions and obligations? Are they in fact effective, or have they become outdated, and do they need to be removed and eliminated? So those are sort of the big three that I would push.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Hal is back at his station. Hal, if you had just dinner with Commissioner Vestager, 3 main ideas you'd share.
Well, I think my first question is, would you please pass the aquavit? After a few glasses of aquavit, we can get down to the serious business. So one thing is already been mentioned is clarity. And in a lot of these cases, it's very unclear what they're actually proposing or thinking or how to enforce this. So this is a big problem. The other is time. I appreciate David's point. It'd be nice to say, let's pause. But the trouble is lots of things are going on. There are acquisitions. Take the Fitbit acquisition. The Fitbit acquisition took more than a year. It was a company that had a 5% market share, and its competitors took advantage of that year's worth of time out. So the question is, you want to be able to move relatively quickly in some of these areas. And I guess those would be my my 2 big questions. Well, I guess if we count the aquavit, there's 3 of them. So.
Very good. Okay, so we have 10 minutes to go, and I can see 2 questions in the chat. I will read them as they are phrased. If anyone of you wants to take a bite at one of them. So the first question is from Ashok, and here it goes. Considering the FANG's power over the social media markets with their strong network effects, how could policy changes promote new company emergence? What kind of dynamic policy revisions prevent anti-competitive acquisitions, Facebook and Instagram? This is the first question. And so it's about how can policy promote new entry in markets where network externalities seem orders of magnitude bigger, it is said, than in other markets. And then there's a question from Kay Jabelli from CCIA. And Kay asks or says, it seems there are so many industries now under threat from tech disruption that are heavily lobbying to put tech giants in handcuffs and encouraging anti-tech populism. What happens next if the regulatory response fails to make things better? Are they actually going to jail? He didn't write that. I made that up. So anyone wants to take a bite at one of these questions? David?
how when I was thinking of hitting the pause button, I was thinking of hitting the pause button on regulation. I agree with you that you got to let competition move forward without putting your finger on the scales too soon. I think if we could do that, and I like the idea of flexible regulation, but I don't quite know what it means, other than that there's a lot of executive authority with the regulators, but that can be used and abused at the same time. I think any competition policy intervention should at least be minimalist to avoid unintended consequences, not ruling out something heavier later on when you actually know what you're talking about.
Can I chime in on that? One thing that's pretty clear is that across the world there's a lot of varieties of regulatory experiments, and so we're seeing various models. We're seeing the model of do's and don'ts, as Rima said, blacklists of prohibited behavior, principle-based. We're seeing the UK type code of conduct, negotiated solutions with companies, prone to possible capture and excessive executive discretion. We're seeing the sort of old US antitrust model where, with cases going from the agency to the court and, breakups and that sort of approach. Or we're also seeing, in Europe, this idea of trying to study more with a tool to investigate market failures, short of anti-competitive conduct. And so I'm just throwing that here to say that it's not like, there's not a monolith of, regulations that's going to fall on big tech. It's exactly we're seeing various approaches. I wonder whether to some extent when we discuss regulation, we're guilty of not drawing, enough lines between these models and, try to carefully consider the pros and cons of each approach. I myself believe that the study and remedy mode is probably a better approach than the other ones. But I'm just throwing that on top of the questions. Kirti, do you want to come in on that?
Sorry, did you say Hal or?
Yeah, sorry.
Hal. Yeah. Actually, I would like to just take it in a slightly different direction. I think the model we're going to see in the next 10 or 20 years is going to be biotech. I mean, look at BioNTech, partnered with Pfizer, a small company, a startup. They could develop an idea. That idea could only be reached fruition by partnering with a large player. Look at the advances in messenger RNA. Look at the list of viral diseases that we may be able to overcome, things like certain kinds of cancer, HIV, flu, common cold. So I think we'll see a huge burst of innovation in this area over the next 3 or 4 years. And then they'll run into the regulation, the same kind of regulation that we've run into. And everybody will have to sort of pull back and think about how could you really push these things forward. So we're on the edge of a major round of innovation in my view.
Okay, Kirti, any thoughts on the various issues which have just been discussed? We can hear you.
Yeah, I think the question is assuming that there's this negative sentiment against FANG, something should be done, what should be done, if nothing's done, there's a problem to be fixed. So there's a presumptive text there. Regardless, we are living in a reality where any potential legislative changes on either, at least on either side of the Atlantic is going to take some time, right? It's perhaps, Rima, you're right, regulation's coming, but apart from, certain policy prescriptions in the near future, we have some time to see these concrete legislative changes occurring in the antitrust law, if you will. So we really need to take this time to quickly develop the tools, exactly to Hal's point, to not just focus on today's, platform hot topic, but recognize that innovation comes from anywhere. it comes from areas we're not thinking about right now. We can't be solving these problems through the blunt tool of antitrust.
Okay, thank you. Rima?
Yeah, Nicola, I think the second question that was posted, I think is quite insightful. I do think that we are in a dangerous, as a tech industry, we're at a difficult moment in time, and I think particularly COVID has only accelerated the techlash in the sense that the digital companies are coming through this period doing incredibly well on a lot of different dimensions. And there is a broad inequality in society, and digital companies are viewed as, driving some of that, threatening some of our fundamental, democratic rights and institutions, and sort of are being blamed for a parade of evils. And I think if, competition law is looked upon as one of the, it's what you do to address bigness, right? And so while the problems of technology are broader than competition, until those things start to get under control, I don't think we're going to see the pressure on the competition, like competition regulators doing something. I don't think that will ease. And so I do think that tech companies really need to take a broader look across their activities and need to step up to the plate and figure out how to work with government, how to drive solutions to the various problems that are being perceived, not just PR solutions, but real solutions across a broad range, of which competition is one piece. And if we don't start doing that, I do worry about what comes next and what more extreme, goodness knows, I hope we're not all in jail next year, but but I don't think that's the outcome. But I do think we will see more extreme ideas gain traction, things like divestiture and others, if more reasonable options don't deliver some sort of tangible progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can see that Bo is back and is probably here to tell us that we need to stop. Bo is a very big man. I'm a very small man, so I will obey and
not in the virtual world.
And you can see that online, but I'm telling you.
We make a good team. We make a good team, Nico.
That's right. Absolutely. We are combinatorial to some extent, or modular.
You're quick. I'm slow and heavy.
Is this the John Stockton, Karl Malone thing, right?
It's a little bit like that, yeah.
And that's it. As far as I go for references to U.S. basketball. Now, so I think it's time to close, and I'll just close with a thought, which is that Rima's point at the moment, and what has been lingering on the panel is also a bit this idea that the division of labor between the instruments of public policy, what is competition policy about versus what is press policy, or if that exists, or privacy policy, seems to be quite mixed up these days, and the demands on antitrust are excessively wide. And unless and until we find a nice and a better way to convince policymakers, like we do with central banking, that there's a limited purpose to the exercise, which is to work for growth and promote economic growth, we're gonna feel the bite of antitrust, keeping and coming again in the future. I hope that in 53 years, which is what separates us from Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber's American Challenge, there will not be a panel at Berkeley discussing Le Défi Américain again, and there will not be a panel. There will not be a panel, saying that talking about sky is falling dynamics, and that indeed the round of innovation that Hal referred to will be with us, and we'll be in a much better place. So I want to thank all the panelists, Hal, Kirti, and Rima, for accepting to talk today. I want to give a big thank you to David Teece for the illuminating keynotes and trying to show us the way forward, the thinking that's ahead of us. And last but not least, Bo and Carla for the superb organization of this online panel. And sorry for being a little over the clock.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Nico. And thanks, David and Rima and Kirti. And Hal, thanks for taking the time and sharing your insights. I'm frustrated, maybe not on the level of David. He has a few extra years of frustration ahead of me, but I'm excited now to work on tools. Like Kirti said, we need to work on tools, and hopefully next year we'll come out with some new initiatives on how to work on this, and hopefully the vaccine will roll out and we'll get to see each other in person. But until then, everybody stay safe and have a great holiday. Rima, you look like you're in the holiday spirit with the tree and the fire. It's great. So have a nice holiday, everyone. Take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
For all the audience, we're going to be back in 10 minutes for the workshops on the not on this call, but on the other links. See you soon. Bye-bye.